I pledge myself to preserve and protect America's fertile soils. Her mighty forests and rivers, her wildlife and minerals, for on there her greatness was established and her strength depends. These are the words of a writer, scientist, and ecologist who led the advancement of a global environmental movement. She was a courageous leader who spoke out to remind everyone that we are a vulnerable part of the natural world, subject to the same damage as the rest of the ecosystem. This fearless woman is Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson grew up on a farm in Springville, Pennsylvania, where she obtained her lifelong love of nature. Her mother encouraged her interest, especially through writing. In only 4th grade, Rachel Carson published her first story, A Battle in the Clouds, which appeared in the St. Nicholas magazine. Carson grew up during a second wave of the Industrial Revolution that occurred in Pittsburgh. She lived next to a huge coal-fired electrical plant which turned her home into a grimy wasteland, with air filled by chemical emissions and rivers polluted by industrial waste. This experience made her forever question the promise of better living through chemistry and of the claims that technology could create a brighter future. Carson used these questions as the foundation in her education, graduating with a biology major in 1929 and as a marine zoologist from the Johns Hopkins University. After attaining her master's degree, Carson began to work at the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries to write radio scripts, and also wrote articles on natural history for the Baltimore Sun. She began her 15-year career in the Federal Service as a science editor in 1936, and rose to become editor-in-chief of all publications for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. On the side, Carson wrote her own articles and books, publishing Under the Sea and The Sea Around Us. These works highlighted her desire to keep the Earth free from pollution and foreshadowed the future struggles she would endure with the leaders of the chemical industry.
It begins with the war-born development of DDT. This diabolical weapon of modern science saved millions of humans, but killed billions of insects.
By 1945, DDT had become the most powerful pesticide that was capable of killing hundreds of different types of insects. DDT was very popular, especially because it had been used in World War II to kill fleas, mosquitoes, and other insects that spread deadly diseases like malaria. Millions of pounds of insecticides and herbicides were spread over acres of forests, prairies, and croplands to kill insects and clear weeds. At this time, humans largely believed themselves to be separate from nature and destined to control it. Rachel Carson argued passionately that nature is a network of interconnections and that the humans threaten its structure at their own peril.
The modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes that man is steadily controlling nature.
Now, to these people, apparently the balance of nature was something that was repealed as soon as man came on the scene. Well, you might just as well assume that you could repeal the law of gravity.
Rachel Carson first tried to warn individuals by contacting Reader's Digest to propose an article about the effects of DDT, but the magazine rejected the idea. Although the initial attempt failed, she was determined to lead the change. 13 years later, in 1958, Rachel Carson received a letter from a friend, Olga Owens Huckins, from Duxbury, Massachusetts. She wrote about the bitter experience of a small world made lifeless and the loss of bird life. The idea of spring without the birds' songs triggered the title Silent Spring, about the consequences of DDT. With the use of DDT increasing, Carson tried again to interest a magazine in publishing her story, but she was once again unsuccessful. With her inability to get an article on DDT published, she decided to tackle the issue of DDT on her own. After 4 years of writing, Rachel Carson published her book Silent Spring. The book focused on the tales of the invisible chemical poisons pervading the world and contaminating food, raising a public uproar that was heard around the world. In her novel, she explained that DDT entered the food chain and accumulated in the fatty tissues of animals, including human beings, and caused cancer and genetic damage. A single application on a crop had a huge reaction lasting for months and would kill all animal life in the area. DDT also remained toxic in the environment after it was diluted by rainwater. DDT could harm birds and animals, which contaminated the world's food supply. One of her most famous chapters was A Fable for Tomorrow, where she depicts a town in America where all life, from fish to birds to apple blossoms to human children, have been silenced by the effects of DDT. At the end of this chapter, Carson writes, "This town does not actually exist, but it might as well easily have 1,000 counterparts in America or elsewhere in the world. I know of no community that has experienced all the misfortunes I describe. Yet every one of these disasters has actually happened somewhere, and in many real communities have already suffered a substantial number of them. Our grim specter had crept upon us almost unnoticed, and this imagined tragedy may easily come a stark reality we all shall know."
With Silent Spring, Carson shows humankind is embedded in the global ecosystem, and she looks at this idea, which is novel at the time, that pesticides, which is really what Silent Spring is about, are contaminating what she calls, again, this total environment.
The book sent an alarm across America and caught the attention of the chemical industry. Manufacturers like Vesicle Corporation sent a letter threatening a libel suit if the book was even published. One of Carson's biggest enemies from the chemical industry was Dr. Robert White Stevens.
The major claims in Miss Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, are gross distortions of the actual facts, completely unsupported by scientific experimental evidence and general practical experience in the field.
Stevens claimed that without chemicals, agriculture would collapse. Monsanto, an agrochemical company, published an article mocking Silent Spring entitled The Desolate Year. Monsanto wrote about the devastation of a world of famine, disease, and where insects went amok because of the ban of chemical pesticides. The Manufacturing Chemists Association also began to mail monthly stories to the news media to try to educate the public on the benefits and importance of pesticides. A letter to the editor of The New Yorker reads, Miss Rachel Carson's reference to the selflessness of our insecticide manufacturers probably reflects her communist sympathies, like a lot of our writers these days. We can live without birds and animals, but as the current market slump shows, we cannot live without business. As for insects, isn't it just like a woman to be scared to death of a few little bugs? As long as we have the H-bomb, everything will be okay. Many others accused Carson of being radical, disloyal, unscientific, and hysterical. Carson fought back and compiled 55 pages of notes and a list of experts who read and approved Silent Spring. At a conference, President John F. Kennedy was questioned about pesticides.
There appears to be growing concern among scientists as to the possibility of dangerous long-range side effects from the widespread use of DDT and other pesticides. Have you considered asking the Department of Agriculture or the Public Health Service to take a closer look at this?
Yes, and I know that they already are. I think particularly, of course, since Miss Carson's book, but they are.
The reports thoroughly justified both Silent Spring and its author, and silenced the chemical industry and agricultural critics. DDT soon came under close government supervision and was eventually banned. This resulted in questioning the use of other pesticides and their dangers as well. Rachel Carson appeared in front of the Senate Committee on Commerce, where she proposed for a commission to be established that would deal with the pesticide issues based on the public interests rather than the profit interest of a few. This commission is the Environmental Protection Agency, and it exists to protect, develop, and enhance the environment. Even though there were many against Carson and Silent Spring, the novel spurred conversationists, ecologists, biologists, social critics, reformers, and organic farmers to join the American environmental movement. Moreover, through dozens of translations, the legacy of Silent Spring became the rise of environmental and green movements worldwide. Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring created a new public awareness that nature was vulnerable to human intervention. Carson was able to show the threats of DDT by discussing the consequences such as contamination of the food chain, cancer, genetic damage, and the death of an entire species. This was too frightening to ignore, and environmentalism was born. Rachel Carson died in 1964, only to have her legacy and global environmental movement continue to progress. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970, and in 1988, a program called Responsible Care was established to help the chemical industry improve its safe management of chemicals from manufacture to disposal. To best understand her legacy, look at eagles. After DDT was dumped into local waters, eagles have almost disappeared. Eggshells became so thin that chicks could not survive. After the help of the Environmental Defense Fund and the federal government's ban of DDT, the population of bald eagles began to rise. In the mid-1960s, fewer than 500 nesting pairs of bald eagles existed in the United States. Today, some 10,000 pairs of bald eagles inhabit our land, and in 2007, the federal government removed bald eagles from the endangered species list. These eagles, as well as other animals, may as well owe their lives to the leadership of Rachel Carson. Before her death, Carson received a letter from a reader acknowledging her leadership and suggesting her legacy. I must thank you. You make us readers understand our place in the world so much better. I know that your great, quiet eloquence will open many eyes and close many bottles.